So we're going to give a couple of minutes for people to come in, and then we're going to start the webinar. Once again, we're letting people come in, and then we're going to start the On the Park Bench webinar in a minute. Okay, we're going to get started here. I wanted to welcome everybody to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation brought to you by the Congress for the New Urbanism. On the Park Bench presents interactive conversations with thought leaders in new urbanism and allied industries, providing an opportunity for the audience to engage in real time. The webinar series is a platform for CNU members to engage, debate, and collaborate on the pressing issues of the day. And the Authors Forum is a series within On the Park Bench, which discusses recently published books by and for urbanists. Today's Authors Forum is on the climate planner overcoming pushback against local mitigation and adaptation plans, with author Jason King and the illustrator of the book, Pamela Stacy King, and discussion with yours truly, Robert Steuteville. So share your thoughts on hashtag On the Park Bench, www.tinyurl.com/OTPB feedback. And I wanted to remind everybody, CNU 30 at Oklahoma City, it's coming up now in approximately 4 months. And it's going to be CNU's first in-person Congress since 2019. The virtual congresses for the last 2 years have been great, but everybody is quite eager, I believe, to get together with friends and colleagues and learn from some of the best planners in the business, walk the city, have a drink at the bar, and do all those fun things that we've done at past in-person congresses. And Oklahoma City is really an amazing place. They have done so much to transform their city that other cities can learn from. They've done that over the last 30 years. It's really going to be a good place to hang out and visit and learn from. Oops. And today's thought leaders, Jason King is the author of The Climate Planner, and he's principal and senior project director at Dover Kohl and Partners. He has directed multidisciplinary teams around the country and has served as the project director and prime author on over 200 plans for cities, towns, neighborhoods, and corridors. That's not a typo, 200 plans, that's a lot. That sounds like a career, Jason, but you're clearly a long way from retirement. And many of those projects, and maybe all of them, Pamela Stacy King, aka Pam Stacy, took part in as a studio director at Dover Kohl. She's the book illustrator for The Climate Planner, and she focuses on form-based codes, comprehensive plans, master plans, and architectural standards. Jason and Pam have worked on local and regional plans across the US that have dealt with the climate problem. They have lots of war stories to tell about how they navigated the political and practical issues at stake in a global problem with local ramifications. I'm Rob Steuteville, editor of CNU's Public Square. I'm the interviewer today. And the climate planner, overcoming pushback against local mitigation and adaptation plans, was published recently by Routledge. And it's a book on how to prepare communities for climate change. We all know we are supposed to think globally and act locally. That's the mantra. For local communities, acting on climate change begins with a plan, which makes urban planners a linchpin in this issue. The climate planner demonstrates how urban planners can make a visible and important difference through local community actions that address the climate problem. We're going to have a brief presentation from both Jason and Pam, followed by a discussion with me, followed by Q&A from the audience. So please use the Q&A function of Zoom to ask your questions as they occur to you. And now I'm going to pass this along to Jason. I can stop my share.
Well, thank you, Rob. Yep. So my name is Jason King with Dover Kohl and Partners.
And I'm Pamela Stacy King, the studio director.
Thanks for the opportunity to talk about the book, and thank you for all of these park bench sessions. We learned a lot from them. Let's get into the book. If you open up the cover, there's the table of contents, and it tells you what the book is about. And it's about dealing with pushback against climate mitigation and adaptation. And it's structured with the 10 objections that we hear the most often, right? Climate change is a lie, it can't be proven, there's no will, there's no money, climate change isn't that bad, it's just a few degrees. What about China? What about India? What does it matter what we do? We've got bigger problems. Retreat isn't an option. It's a lost fight. It's too late. Someone will fix this. Some new technology is going to come right around the corner and fix everything. I'll be dead when this happens. These are the things that we hear. We can't even begin to start climate planning until we can maneuver our way around these in the public forum and host a conversation about international politics in a lot of ways. We're not able to do that without a little bit of background knowledge, and this book has been that for me. And the next part of the book is talking about how to create great climate plans, and this works for creating all kinds of plans. It's the charette method that the CNUs know so well. Part 3 is about 2 cities. We look at a very dry city and a coastal city, El Paso and Miami, and we imagine what these cities will be like in 2050. And the bottom line is really, the cities that start the earliest will survive the longest, even if they have a lot of natural disadvantages. The book talks about how, it is a concept, a theory by Professor Chapin of FSU, that you can divide urban planning into 4 different eras. And I'm not sure if it's true, but it is definitely fascinating to me, because my career, I started with growth controls, right? TDRs and concurrency, wetland protection and rate of growth ordinances and open space ratios. It was stopping growth. Then comprehensive plans. The most important thing I could do as a planner was to create the comprehensive plan. And then it seems like other plans are so much more important. Urban design plans, climate adaptation plans, affordable housing plans. And at smart growth, I think the CNU and the new urbanism is the best articulation of what smart growth really is. It's part of our work. I hope it continues to be into the future, but now we're talking more about sustainability, and we're talking about climate planning, and we're talking about equity. We're talking about trying to avoid the big twin catastrophes of climate change and the continued stratification of our society, So I think we are important to the degree we know how to be the planners of sustainability. And, the big news recently is the $1 trillion Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act out of the Biden administration, the federal government, and it's very exciting. It's just that money comes down to the local level. It's the local level where climate planning really occurs. It's critical to avoid catastrophes. And all of you know this, at the local level, there isn't consensus that the climate is even changing. the conversation out there that we have is not what you'd read about in the New York Times or the Guardian or even the USA Today. There's not consensus in Texas and Florida and Virginia and Maine, in Oregon and Idaho where we work. There's not a consensus that something needs to happen, nor is there an agreed upon approach. And so this is very messy, very difficult work. And so I was honored, Liz Potter-Zyberg talked about how the book was war stories, and it being messy work, it is war stories. We did do 200 projects. We work all over the place. And we have been working during this period of denial and skepticism. And so, what we're going to do today is we're not going to do the 101 stuff. I think Liz did a phenomenal job talking about what climate change is and how and what it means to our profession. Instead, I think it might be useful just to tell a couple war stories. Like one appears in the book, Dauphin Island, Alabama, described as the most unlucky island in the world because just about every hurricane that hits the United States through the Gulf hits Dauphin Island. And Dauphin Island is two pieces, right? It's the West End area, the big, long, sandy spit, the peninsula with the big, beautiful houses. And then it's sort of the core of the island. And the problem with Dauphin Island and the problem with all of our coastal communities is that the land is washing away, the storms are more turbulent. And for Dauphin Island, which is its own municipality, these houses that rent, at $5,000 a month, these $5,000 a week, these are the houses that pay for local services. And it's getting, we can imagine a future in which they will not be around any longer. In this graphic, you see the ocean, the coastline used to be where it is blue, and now it is where it's red. A lot of our coastal communities are simply disappearing. And so how does the community pay for itself? How does it survive? Dauphin Island's got a downtown that looks like this. When we started working there, DeSoto Ave, I've been pretty hard hit by hurricanes. 40% of small businesses don't survive extreme weather events, and DeSoto Ave had seen a lot of weather events. That little blue building in the foreground, that's not even there anymore. So if they lose the property taxes and the sales taxes on the big houses, and they have to survive based on what they have in the downtown, then they're in trouble, right? And this is where the new urbanism comes in. So Dauphin Island, like a lot of places, received money through a big settlement, through the Deepwater Horizon spill. 20 billion went out to communities, over 300 went to Mobile and Baldwin, 16 or so went to Dauphin Island, and that a tiny fraction of that got us to the island virtually to start working on the plan. And during the precharette, we picked this small harbor area. It's called Aloe Bay. And I imagined what a truly resilient place would be, lifting the land, bulwarking the land, creating real fortifications in a way. I wanted to imagine a place that would last no matter what happened into the future. These small businesses lifted 15 feet up on a kind of super levee, which is still attractive, still interesting, still a nice place to be. Anyway, these would endure. And you can imagine what the reaction was, really quick, 3,500 views on our little YouTube film. And
For a very small community.
that's right, for a small community. That's a lot of attention really fast. People said, no, this was the pushback. They said they like Dauphin Island because it's underdeveloped. They wouldn't go there anymore. This was too much. And so this is the form that pushback comes in when you really want to solve the problem and you know how do you get everyone to come along with you? The first thing that we do is we try to find sort of compromise. We created 3 different scenarios which pulled back from the idea of big infrastructure. A Main Street scenario. Sue Zhang in our office came up with a living shoreline. Rob Piatowski imagined everything up on stilts. And just like Liz was talking about during her presentation, we gave people options. We let them vote. And during the charrette, we had, conversations with nearly 250 people. It was virtual because this was just done last year. People wanted accessibility, sustainability, green, beautiful, and vibrant place. We did the community image survey. And when we showed the shoreline, they were less interested in the big bulwark, and they were more interested in the natural edge with boardwalks over natural areas. They were interested in kayak launches. They liked the idea of dining on the water, but they wanted new development to happen in the form of small shops, right? It's very different than the 3 to 4 story mega investment that I had drawn originally. Development should fit in, should add destinations. Economic development should encourage and build the town's tax base. These are the big 5 ideas from the project. Increase access to nature, build sustainably, seek balance of culture, community, commerce, and nature. And so then came the compromise, new solution. Our team worked on a design. Kenneth Garcia did a phenomenal job of illustrating it. Here, it's a much lighter touch. The buildings are smaller, but the buildings are lifted. The water would flow right underneath them, and it would hit DeSoto Ave. DeSoto Ave itself would be lifted 5 to 7 feet. It would be a kind of breakwater. And what that allows for is the small town charm that people like about Dauphin Island. There's still hundreds of thousands of square feet of commercial, and there is still a strong tax base here, but we designed it in a way that had a light touch when it comes to nature, right? It'll float above the water. We worked with the community and with other members of the team to pick the specific uses for this place. It's still a lot more resilient, both physically and economically, but it's a design that made sense, and with a whole lot of public open space, spots for people to see the sunset. Now, the hard thing about designing coastal areas is everything has to be lifted, but you do have a lot of leeway. The bottom floor, as long as they are breakable walls, as long as air conditioning systems are lifted and heating systems and cooking systems are not, as long as that's all below freeboard, as long as that's all, above freeboard, above where the water will come, you are able to put in bars and ice cream places and small temporary restaurants, right? So one challenge for urbanism is that interface between the building and the street. How do you design that in a place that will one day see 11 feet of water? Sue did a great job of designing a new West End, and it's walkable, mixed use. It's built. This is what the charter is about, and this is what new urbanists do best. There will be a lot of retreating from areas of town and moving to places like this. We want to think about migration regionally. People leave the coast and go inland, but a lot of our work is happening at the local level. What part of town will they retreat from, and what part of town will they resettle at higher densities? And how can those higher densities be, elegant, nice places where people want to be? And then the other bit here, important, I think, is what happens, when the Category 5 rolls in. People have been thinking about Alabama and Dauphin Island for a long time. This is a sketch that was done by a local architect that involved floodgates that would close. For us, we took a more natural, but still very strong approach. We didn't build the land up and out like in my first iteration, but we did restore wetlands. There's a new coastal bluff system. There's a peninsula that sticks out in order to protect the bay. You have to think about the wave activity and the winds, and we've got to design more resilient. In order to be a new urbanist, we've all had to learn how to become traffic engineers, landscape architects, and illustrators, and form-based code experts. We know enough about economics and equity and sociology for us to function. We can argue with the Department of Transportation The other thing that we're going to need to become, I think, in order to adapt is coastal engineers, right? So take Seaside, for instance, our mecca, the most important thing that new urbanism has created in a lot of ways. I haven't been there in a long time, but everybody loves Seaside. And the new design for the downtown Seaside done by Dan Prolick and Opticos. The question is what does happen to that beach? The oceans are going to rise 2 feet by 2050. What's the plan for that beach? You know, the rendering stops at the water. Is it going to be beach renourishment, replenishing sand? Is it going to be structural reinforcement? These perpendicular structures are called groins. They catch the sand, they hold it. Is there going to be offshore underwater breakwaters? We're going to be asked. We have to have some idea. And are those breakwaters going to be natural? Are they going to be oyster beds? These breakwaters stop the wave action. They stop erosion. Or is it going to be big engineering? You know, what is the approach? These, instead of quarried granite, what's happening now is more often we're using these concrete armor units to protect the shore. Or what happens on the land? You know, do we stabilize with vegetation? Will that be enough? Or will it take levees and super levees? We'll have to know. We'll have to have an answer. And what are we planning for? Is it the short term, the midterm? At what point do we need to retreat? That's another question. And the reason the new urbanists have to know about this is because if we don't, then the Army Corps of Engineers steps in. And Liz in her presentation showed this design to protect Miami. Big, ugly wall, cheap, easy to build, uniform along the whole coast. What's not to like about this? But locally, EDSA, working with Swire Properties, they came up with a just as resilient but attractive amenity of an approach, something that people could like. We're going to have to learn how to do that too. We're going to have to learn revenants and seawalls and coastal armoring. We're going to have to learn how to design with nature, but cognizant of the fact that a lot of times nature's out to get us. Anyway, yeah.
All right, so Pamela Stacy King, and I edited and illustrated the book, but I was also a part of all of these different projects and the push and pull that comes. And I think one of the big things is just not getting discouraged as you're going along. At Dover Kohl, we often start our days with a little bit of sketching, everybody together. This is an idea from Victor Dover and James Doherty, you know, because when you can put it down on paper, you can draw it, then you really understand things a lot better. And so the climate planner really talks about a lot of places like Miami Beach and the Florida Keys that are in dire threat due to sea level rise. That's one of the things you hear about a lot. It's one of the main topics that people talk about with this. But Miami Beach is not a disposable city. You know, there are billions of dollars of investment in the city, and there's things that, you know, you just don't want to lose, like the Park Central Hotel and the historic district. And Miami Beach is a place that has been combating climate change for a long time, even if that wasn't their stated or intended purpose. Those big, wide, sandy beaches are not natural. They are replenished. They are built. They are levees that are protecting the further inland areas. You can see old black and white movies, and you can see Lummis Park, which is across the street from the Art Deco district, and the waves are just on the other side of the wall, just lapping. And now you've got a quarter mile of sand that can be used for event space and moving people. And so that is a protection that the city of Miami Beach puts a lot of money into. But they've gone further as well. In more recent years, they've been installing new pumps and backflow preventers and raising roads that some people like and some people don't. But they've really been forward thinking and willing to have action. But they don't always, you know, once things are implemented, people start to resist. They want to reorient. There is new administrations that come in that want to do their own planning. And people get tired of living in construction zones. You know, it takes a lot to raise a road and to put those pump systems into place. You're rebuilding your infrastructure. And that also costs a lot of money, which people don't want to spend. They don't want to have new taxes. So after a long pause and several years of not doing anything and just doing more and more studies, all of those studies kept pointing to the same thing. You can't just sit and do nothing, or the city of Miami Beach, which then protects the city of Miami, is just not going to survive with all these storms. So you need to do something to at least help it last longer. But one of those things in the pause that happened was that there was a new CRA, a redevelopment plan that was done. And what that did is it took taxes that were already being generated, and instead of sending them back to the whole county, they are now staying in Miami Beach, specifically to put in resilience infrastructure. And so, you know, during the pause, trying to do what you can to make things more habitable, or not habitable, sorry, acceptable to people, you know, so it's less money coming out of their pocket, but still getting the infrastructure that's needed. The climate planner also talks about places that are very arid and don't have enough water. Places like Lauderdale, Texas. When we were there, we stayed at the La Posada Hotel. It's right across, looks across the Rio Grande into Mexico. And it's on this beautiful square with these big trees. But the rest of the downtown is losing its trees. It's losing its shade. It's not just the fact that it's an arid place, but when trees got old, they couldn't be replaced. The codes that were in place said that were very suburban standards. And so you needed 8 feet with the tree at least 4 feet from the road in order to plant a tree, even in the downtown. So where you already had your infrastructure and streets in place, these were suddenly illegal and couldn't be done. There was a lot of push and pull as to exactly why that happened, but there's a new code now being done by Able Cities that is fixing that and allowing street trees to be replaced in the downtown to give them back their tree canopy. And that's going to help reduce, you know, the heat effects, that less heat island effect, and storing some carbon and helping keep the downtown a habitable place. The book, one of the other big cities that the book talks about is El Paso. And our firm has been there for a long time working, starting with Plan El Paso more than 10 years ago, or just about 10 years ago. And although the climate discussion now is so prominent in everyone's mind, it wasn't in 2012. There were some people talking about it, but they were more on the edge. And Plan El Paso took it on. There is a chapter that is just about sustainability and being resilient and looking at what they can do to keep their city livable. Now they're in Texas, so they kind of had to go it alone. You know, they had Rick Perry as a governor at that time, who doesn't believe in climate change, denying it, you know, downplaying the effects of humans. And even though Rick Perry is no longer the governor, they're still in Texas, and this is a very common belief. But they forged ahead, working with both mitigation and adaptation. El Paso, looking at adaptation, is a very dry city. They are in the desert. One of the things they've done for a long time is really a campaign to help just individual consumers use less water. It's both a public campaign of letting people know, but also increasing water rates so that you feel it in your wallet what the true cost of this resource is and how important it is. They also have the largest desalination plant that is inland in the country, but they also are, you know, reusing and reclaiming every drop of water they can. They are one of the few cities that have a toilet to tap program. You know, they are re-drinking their water. They haven't gone quite as far as Dune, but, you know, we may all end up, you know, going that far and just making sure we don't waste a drop, because it is a precious resource. Looking at mitigation, they have a very extensive bus rapid transit system going to the different outskirts of the city and bringing everyone back into the downtown. But it's not just the bus system. When we were there to work on the plan, there were these posters going up by Peter Sfarbian. They were saying the trolley is coming. There was a trolley that connected the inland neighborhoods, the close-in neighborhoods to the downtown, as well as across the border to Juarez, Mexico. And we're like, well, what's going on with this trolley? Well, there was nothing going on with the trolley. It was just an art campaign of Peter Sfarbian's, but it made it into the plan. It's a great idea.
And Peter Sparbian became city councilman.
Mhm. And so Plan El Paso, the comprehensive plan for the city, talks about how you need to connect the university to the downtown with these trolleys. Those trolleys still existed. They were out in the desert on the outskirts of the airport, and they were refurbished and the lines were laid. And wherever those lines were laid, you see construction cranes and reinvestment happening that is, bringing more people back to those inland cities, but also just repairing the city where it had been skipped over for a long time. In addition to that, there's many new bike facilities and bike routes, as well as El Paso had a similar tree story to Laredo, where trees were no longer planted, they were kind of outlawed, and so trees are back. Even in these dry areas, once a tree can establish its roots, that's a local tree, a drought tolerant tree, then they really can survive on the small amount of water that these places get. And there's stories throughout of, both where there's been success and where there hasn't. South Miami, Florida, it was a forward-thinking city that requires solar panels on all new construction. Fort Lauderdale saw the dramatic effects of a storm event when A1A was washed away, and looking at building it back higher and bulwarking it in order to protect the adjacent properties and the rest of Fort Lauderdale. But they're not all coastal. Sandy Woods, Rhode Island, which is a project by Union Studio Architecture, they are using wind in order to power their community, as well as growing their own food. And Newfield is an up-and-coming project that is really looking to preserve 30% of the site just as natural, as well as preserving agricultural lands into perpetuity, along with the development of the community. They stories go further afield to Thailand, where the bleaching corals were studied back in the 80s and 90s. And even though you couldn't necessarily test the temperature of the water in order to see the difference, you could tell the water levels were rising, the temperatures were rising because of all the bleaching corals. And again, the Mission Trail in Texas, which was historically an agricultural community that planted in the floodplains of the Rio Grande, that it just isn't flooding because it's controlled. But they're now doing hydroponics in order to continue and keep alive that tradition of growing food and using less soil and less water. And so just, if you can talk about the different problems, then you can report on different solutions, and the more ideas and solutions and ways to come about attacking the problem and how things can be addressed locally, the more likely you are to get people to move forward on it. So, yes, thank you.
That was a lot.
Awesome. That's really cool. I wanted to remind everybody to ask your questions in the Q&A function of Zoom rather than the chat. And we will get to those questions soon enough. We're going to be having a discussion here with myself and Jason and Pam. And thank you very much for excellent presentations. I wanted to touch on adaptation, the difference between adaptation and mitigation. And it seems like to me, and I thought that there was evidence of this in the book, that there's a tension between adaptation and mitigation. Some people want to address adaptation, other people want to address mitigation and think, it's a mistake to do adaptation. Can you describe how these two things, if you see the tension between these two, if what urban planners can do to resolve that tension.
Yeah, that's right. So the conversation about climate, first, we couldn't have the conversation, right? And then when we could talk about mitigation. We could talk about decreasing our carbon pollution. But the people, the early adopters of the climate conversation, the environmental community, they didn't like to talk about adaptation, because talking about adaptation felt like you were giving up, right? And the way they saw it, there was no adaptation that was going to solve the world's problems. You had to eliminate the core issue, the carbon pollution itself. So when we first started drawing seawalls or even lifted roads, there was a lot of pushback at that. You know, you're changing the environment. How can you design with nature? We kept being asked, and still prevent against a 15-foot wave. Now it feels like we're able to talk about both, and both are important, how we can mitigate and how we can adapt. Sadly, I think we've gotten used to the idea that even if we stopped all carbon pollution right now at this moment, we've still got 30 years of drying rivers and rising seas that we need to deal with. And here's the thing, right? The New Urbanists are great at this. We're able to draw dense, walkable places. We're able to adapt. We're able to move people from the hinterlands, which the charter talks about, and into the centers, which the charter focuses on, and give them actually a better life. So what we need to think about, I think, is the heavy infrastructure that we'll also need. The desalination plants, the coastal armoring. I think this is what we need to learn a little bit more about as urbanists.
And the adaptation is much more varied, is it not? I mean, mitigation seems like a problem that is fairly similar worldwide, how to mitigate for climate change, although there could be differences in local communities. But adaptation is really quite different for every community.
And it's tough, right? Being a traveling consultant. So on one coast, you're working with rising seas, and on another coast, you're dealing with wildfires. You know, you're dealing with places that have too much water, and where the rain never stops, and you have places where it never seems to rain at all. And so, and the solutions are very, very local. So as out-of-town consultants, as traveling experts, we've got to know generally how to approach it, but we really have to rely on our local understanding. We're working in Martha's Vineyard. Last night, a presentation was given to us by a non-professional climate planner, which was so smart about the vineyard and its particular challenges that we took a lot of notes. It'll be a big part of our plan.
You guys did a plan for Panama City, Florida, to recover after Hurricane Michael, which was a catastrophic storm that hit, I think, Category 5, hit in 2018. I don't know what the source of this was, but you talk about in the book that there was a reluctance to actually address climate change. After some soul searching, Dover Kohl decided to take it head on. And this was a plan that won a charter award in 2020. But this seems like a major theme of the book, that you're urging planners to address climate change head on, even in places that perhaps aren't imminently in danger, like Panama City. Can you talk a little bit about that process of going from not wanting to address, or reluctant to address it, to addressing it head on, and what happened and how that relates to other communities?
That's right. Yeah. So it's easy to forget, but just 10 years ago, we were not allowed to write climate change or sea level rise. And Panama City is one of a bunch of projects. Lubbock, Texas, Henrico County, Virginia, the Florida Keys, Laredo, Texas, places where the words climate change and sea level rise were felt to be political. Those were Democrat words, right? We had the Obama re-election. We had the the Trump political contest, and the whole country was so divided that you could talk about resilience and you could talk about sustainability, you could talk about oscillations in weather, and you could talk about, but you could never name the thing itself, like the Harry Potter reference, Lord Voldemort. You weren't allowed to say his name, even though everybody knew that's what was going on. And we had to work under those conditions. We had clients saying, please don't say this. We had governors and state senators not allowing us to use these words in our reports. A lot's changed since then. But yeah, that's right. It was a difficult period, and it just reminds you that there's a lot in our profession we just can't talk about, but yet we have to proceed, right? We still have to create plans that help communities. So yeah, it's an interesting part of that is the book. We're talking about how we dance around these topics, how we deal with these things head on without appearing to deal with them head on.
Well, I think also we still have some of that pushback where we will present ideas, because now, we are committed to making sure we do present, what can happen and what can you do for it. And we still get the pushback of like, well, maybe you shouldn't talk about that, at least in public. And it's like, all right, well, if we can't talk about it in public, we still want to talk about it with you, our client, the city. So at least it's not the first time the next time it comes up, it's not the first time you've heard it. And so it can kind of sink in, and maybe eventually then they'll be more willing to take action.
And they are generally willing to do this. I mean, they're after all paying you for your time, and you're wanting to spend your time on talking about this. And if they're reluctant, so there's there's a bit of tension there too.
Yeah, and the thing is, I don't want to spend my time talking about climate change. It's so grim. I want to be an urbanist. I want to talk about cafes and sidewalks and bike paths and really cool mixed-use places. But we have no choice. There's a responsibility there, and so there we are. We find ourselves. We've got to do the plan people want, but we also have to do the plan that they need at the same time.
Now, Panama City was a recovery plan, and so obviously that place has a future, but there are some places that I think you think that maybe don't have a future. I mean, there was one place mentioned in the book that you said that you didn't think that there should be a plan for rebuilding. So where do you draw the line, and where should communities draw the line in the future as to what should be recovered and what not? And that's going to be a difficult question, don't you think?
Yeah, what a good point. So there's no one rule. We have to take every case individually. There are communities that cannot survive the next 50 years, 2 feet of sea level rise, or the desertification of certain parts of the country. There are certain neighborhoods where the wildfires will just never stop. So there's no one rule we can bring into the situation. We've got to take each case and give our best advice. Yeah.
It kind of leads to the question of migration, and this was kind of a theme throughout the book. And there are some places where perhaps people will be migrating out of because there's a greater threat. There's going to be other places people are going to be moving into. Maybe some, there might be a combination. It seems like there is less of a discussion on how climate change deals with places where people are going to be moving in, where the in-migration is occurring. What are and some of these are far away regions of the country, some are close by, and as you mentioned in your talk. And what are the places that are likely to see in-migration? Why is it important to plan for that? And how do these new urbanist ideas apply to the places that are going to be getting in migration?
Yeah, good questions. I guess, we like to think about northern areas where the land is higher and the temperatures are cooler. We like to think about the Great Lake areas where there's plenty of water. And when we become futurists, we think about people moving. But the reality is, there's probably going to be a lot less global migration than we want to admit, because it's expensive and it's hard for people to leave behind their home, and people are able to deal and live in very dangerous and almost intolerable circumstances for long periods. So that's the thing. I like the idea of all getting on the train. Let's go and revive Detroit. But the reality is people won't be leaving, and we need to dig in. There's just not the money to, quite often, personal level or the municipal level. So we're going to have to contend with these issues more than I think we're comfortable talking about personally. Nevertheless, we do plans for communities. We did one for Hammond, Louisiana. We did one for upstate New York. These are in-migration plans. These are getting these places ready for big new populations. We did one in Enrico County, Virginia. We're doing our best to get other places that are a little further away from harm, and getting them ready for higher densities, but still no less good a quality of life, right? We need to design density in a way that it's desirable and choice-worthy.
Do you have any thoughts on migration, Pam, and how to address that?
Miami.
Well, I mean, yeah, you hear, eventually everyone's going to have to leave Florida, but it's not going to be something that happens overnight. And so just looking, as Jason mentioned, how to work with those kind of cities early, and how do you get them ready for, I can't think of anything other than Jason said, he said it so well, with the choice-worthy places. And it's just going to be really hard for people when they do need to move. But in a way, we already are seeing it. It's not just people within the United States moving into the United States. It's people in Central America who are living in bad conditions, and the foods that they used to grow and have their livelihood off of are no longer growing. And that's why we're seeing a lot of the migration happening coming up through Mexico and the border issues that we have. It's definitely a big concern. And where are those people going? And the locals in, Montana and places where people are heading, they're going to push back because they don't want to change. And so it's another part of the conversation that hasn't been talked about enough, but it's definitely going to cause a lot of strife for a lot of people.
And just really quick, Rob, you're seeing in our plans, like Plan Novi, a plan from North Beach that Pam was really a prime author of. She has short-term, mid-term, and long-term. And in the short term, there's things we do. We're digging in, we're bulwarking. In the mid-term, probably also. But in the long term of our plans, you're starting to see retreat and revegetation. So you got to think about that when you're doing these coastal plans: short-term, mid-term, and long-term.
I'm going to get to some questions from the audience, and this one's probably pretty quick, but and I think this question was asked by Aaron back when you were talking about Dauphin Island. And what is the basis that you're looking at for sea level rise in these communities?
Yeah. So when you go into the community, you need a rule of thumb, oversimplification. We tend to say 2 feet of rise by 2050. Now, the reality is more complicated. The IPCC gives us a range, and the water levels will be different in different places. But generally, because it's got to be simple, you've got to be able to communicate, and you've got to draw fast. 2 feet of rise by 2050 is what we use.
Mark asks about a small town in Indiana where he lives. They're doing a lot of work on downtown revitalization and design, but there is no focus on efforts to develop a climate action or mitigation plan. What advice do you have to get the community and local leadership to start thinking about these things and planning?
Yeah, just so you can just start the conversation light, right? The world's getting warmer and drier in Indiana, just like everywhere else. You can start the conversation. Hopefully there's a bite. Hopefully people are interested. Sometimes that's the only thing we can do. we're the first ones that say climate change. And we've got to leave it to someone else, 3 administrations later, to commission a climate action plan. If we do that, we're still doing something. If we're starting the conversation, we're still making a positive contribution. Pam talked about one project where no one wanted to talk about climate change because the solutions were expensive in Miami Beach. Well, when we came up with a local sales tax capture mechanism that would pay for resilience, when we created a new redevelopment agency with a new funding mechanism, which meant it wasn't going to be higher property taxes. If you can create a new way to pay for resilience, then you might find it easier to have the conversation. So that might be where to start. How can you start a fund which eventually you'll be using, to adapt your town?
I think it's also just doing some a little bit of research on your own. I haven't worked in Indiana, but what are the things you're really going to see there? Some places it's easy to tell it's either arid or it's on the coast or it's got wildfires. What are the big concerns in your town? Or is that a great place that you're going to see more migration, which actually doing the downtown plan and revitalizing that is a great first step, because you're re-inhabiting your downtown, you're making places where more people can come into your community and thrive without a big impact on the rest of the city. So I was trying to see what are the big issues in your area that you're going to need to address, and then kind of working those into the work that you're already doing.
That's a really good point. Downtown revitalization is itself climate adaptation, because you're resettling an area with probably not a lot of people. You're getting it ready for more people. That alone is climate work.
Got a question from Mary, who's an architect in El Paso. Really appreciates the work that you folks have done there. And she is actually working on the advanced water purification facility under design. But she is wondering how much work you're doing with El Paso on an ongoing basis to see the implementation of all these ideas that you came up with in the comprehensive plan.
Yeah, so it's been 11 or 12 years working in El Paso. We've always got some project in El Paso. So after 10 years, you can look back on your plan and say, what happened? Did it get implemented? Did it not? So we're working in El Paso now, Pam, especially on Alameda corridor, and we're bringing up Plan El Paso from 10 years ago. And hey, how come this hasn't been implemented? Why isn't this committee created? So, we're often hired to do vision plans, but if we have a continuing relationship like we have in El Paso, we keep the conversation about implementation going. El Paso is about to pass a new quality of life bond. The last one was $500 million. We're part of the conversation to make sure that the next one is about adaptation. It's about water, it's about shade, it's about microclimate. So anyway, you just continue to have a relationship with these communities, and you continue to remind them of what's in the plan, and you help them find funding sources. And
it's not just the official relationship with the city, especially in Texas and El Paso and other communities, we find local partners that we're working with, and they kind of become our friends, and we're constantly having conversations. And so Carlos Galinar in the city of El Paso, as well as CEA Group, they are parts of each of the projects that we work on, and they're there locally, able to advocate for them and in order to keep things moving forward. And sometimes you hit a wall and you got to put it aside for a while. I know Carlos, who I mentioned a moment ago, was working with the city, and then he moved and he was working with the school board and trying to make advancements on ideas from Plan El Paso as far as making smaller local schools. But the way the school system was set up, he made some progress, but not a lot. And so then he moves on to other topics, really trying to push that implementation.
Nancy asks if it used to be the people who lived in a community that was heavily damaged or destroyed by a natural disaster, they wanted to build back the same. And she was wondering whether this attitude has changed, if people are more willing to look at significant changes in how they build back.
Yeah, the book talks a lot about that. When the urban planners come in, we want to get everyone out of the flood zones, right? We want to get everyone to the center of town. We want to retreat and reorganize and redesign. But on a personal level, if your house was knocked down, all you want is to get back to normal. You know, that's what everyone wants. They just want to rebuild back as fast as possible. It's a state of trauma. And so this is a hard thing. Also, our policies, our FEMA policies used to require you to build back right in that same spot. They've only started to try to move. We're only starting to read about communities that are being bought out, relocated. There's only a couple that, ever. So it was always hard for us. After we did the Mississippi Renewal Charrette, a lot of the New Urbanistan were part of that. We went to Gulfport, we went to Ocean Springs, we went to Biloxi, we said, you guys have to do everything completely different. So that way this doesn't happen again. And that's not what they wanted at all. They wanted everything back to normal. And so what do? It's just a kind of compromise. It's upzoning the downtown so that way there's a place to go to when it finally comes the day they've given up. They don't want to leave the community. There's a condo in town that they can move to. Eventually in Jean Lafitte, Louisiana, they'll get tired of replacing the rugs and the furniture. So we designed a center that they can move to, that can be reinforced, that can be protected. So you got to be sympathetic to the desire to not, to just build back exactly like it was. But at the same time, as urban planners, we have a responsibility to pick areas that will densify and will receive people.
I think you made a good point, Jason, too. You kind of quickly went over it, that the systems we have in place after, disaster recovery and FEMA monies and insurance monies, those are to build back what you already had. And it is just more recently that the conversation on those has been changing in what if it doesn't make sense to build back? Is that money just gone, or can you use that money another way? Because traditionally it's to replace what was lost. And so that incentivizes people to stay where they are and to not move on. And so figuring out how to allow people who have had the worst thing happen to them have the option to not build back, to build somewhere else, because otherwise they build back, but they don't want to be there, and they move, but they sell that house to somebody else, and then that person is in danger. And so it's still an evolving conversation on how this migration can even happen.
Howard asks if there's any unique or interesting city regional scale climate action plans that you came across in your research. I think we've been talking about some already, but probably the biggest case study in the book is a regional plan. Can you talk about that scale of planning with regard to climate action plans?
Yeah, sure. I learned a lot from CPEX, the Center for Planning Excellence, located in Baton Rouge, because they're planning Louisiana. Louisiana is the front line. They're planning regionally, and CPEX has been doing this for a long time. So when I think about regional planning, I always go to them. What the problems that Louisiana is dealing with, the rest of us will have to deal with in time. And CPEX has been brave and innovative through all of this. But yeah, the book talks about 750, the plan for Southeast Florida. Dover Kohl, Dwayne Potter-Zyberg, Marcella Kemblor, a bunch of great firms got to work together on the plan for Southeast Florida. And that was a regional plan. And it's a regional plan for new transportation systems, for adaptation, for retreat. We learned a lot. Liz Potter-Zyberg and Andrew Georgiadis were big parts of that. So, it's hard to summarize. So as to say, a big part of the book is regional planning for vulnerable place. It's the 750 case study. And I think it's the most interesting part of the book because it isn't straightforward. We were fought by every by every Tea Partier and anti-government group in the books. Divisive politics. The whole thing was born in Florida, and we had to deal with it. We were accused of being Agenda 21 conspiracy. I don't know, minions of the UN. It's an interesting case study because it was just such a hard project.
I mean, yeah, it really does make a great story. I should tell people that we're at the 1 hour mark. It's 1 o'clock and Eastern time. Typically these go on for an hour, but can go on longer, and there are more questions to answer if you folks are willing to keep on talking. For those who need to leave, we will be posting this video probably in a day, and you can see your answers, answers to any questions that we didn't get to. But if it's okay, you want to continue to talk and about this topic?
Yeah, we had lunch already. We're good.
Okay,
Yep.
good. Calandra asks, I hope I got that right. What policy interventions do local leaders in climate migration hotspots need to consider to protect long-term constituents from green gentrification and climate change migration impacts?
Good question. Yeah, so I think the first time I read about climate gentrification was Miami, because we've got a city, Pam and I live in Miami. We've got a city real divided, rich and poor. And the rich always lived along the coast and the poor always lived inland. And now there's a movement, right? So the wealthy are moving to the upland, inland areas. And it is displacing poorer people.
So this is Miami, so it goes back down on the other side towards the Everglades. And
Yeah, that's
the
right.
poor are getting pushed out that way and flooded because of the Everglades.
Yeah, it's true. So Miami, we're really in trouble because we got the ocean on one side, we got the Everglades on the other. So there's a little ridge that you can live in, and your home won't, flood zone X, and won't be flooded all the time. And of course, there's a lot of competition to live in that area, and it's increasing. And we can just imagine climate, making our gentrification problems much worse. And the only solution is just the whole toolkit of anti-gentrification and affordable housing and affordable commercial spaces. It's public subsidy, it's nonprofits, it's redevelopment agencies. It is a topic of another book and another talk, I think.
Brian asks if there are recommended resources for info on migration destinations. It's something I've been interested in. There's been a lot of talk about receiver cities, but I haven't ever seen a list of what they are. So I don't, do you have any resources on that?
No, there isn't a book called Receiver Cities. These park benches is where I've been learning about welcoming cities and receiving cities. I think the Normanism is at the beginning of this conversation. I don't know what the guidebook is yet to designing your receiver city.
We need to have a on the park bench topic, receiver cities.
Just really quick, the tough thing about the receiver city is a lot of times you're designing a city for new density and the locals don't want it, right? So that's the difficulty. How do you design places for greater density to receive refugees when chances are there's going to be a huge,
Locals don't want it.
Yeah, there's going to be a huge NIMBY backlash against that. It's going to be an interesting topic to our whole sphere to learn that we're going to have to learn.
Right. It might be slower, though. It might be a slow process where there's sort of a demand that rises for housing, and then they'll have to respond. Right. I mean, it could be a fast process or it could be a slow process.
What do you think, Rob? You're probably the expert on this now because you've been the moderator on these sessions. And what do you think about receiver cities? What's the next steps for us? Where do we learn more?
Uh, Well, I would like to, I mean, it's difficult to sort of have a list of receiver cities because, there's going to be a lot of places on that list. But I would like to see a list put together of perhaps examples of receiver cities, of various types of receiver cities. One thing that was made clearer to me in your book is a lot of these places are going to still be very close to where people are perhaps retreating from. They're not necessarily going to go to Detroit. I mean, they may go to Hammond, Louisiana, as opposed to Detroit. Or some of them might go to Detroit as well, or Pittsburgh or Buffalo.
Right. Yeah. The other hard thing is after a place gets wrecked, it becomes cheap real estate. And in a country where the real estate is so expensive and the housing crisis is so dire, I think you're actually going to see a strange migration into dangerous places just for want of a place to live.
Mhm. It's a very complicated discussion. This is just a quick question from Aaron. Did Panama City adopt any ordinances, code reform off of your planning effort?
Well, they did. They adopted a great plan. The strategic vision for Panama City's historic downtown and waterfront, led by Victor Dover and Amy Groves, is a great plan. And there's a section on resilient infrastructure. There's a section on sustainable buildings. And I don't know if they've moved into the code phase yet, but they've got a great framework for doing that.
And the plan calls for a code, right?
Yeah, it does. Every one of our plans, right? Every one of our vision plans says we got to update the land development regulations. And it's especially true now with climate.
A guy named Victor, you may know, asked the question, I think for Louisa. Have you been involved in any conversations about racial and environmental justice as it relates to adaptation planning and retreat? I think he knows the answer to that.
Yeah, that's right. Liz said it. Elizabeth Platter-Zyberg said something really interesting the other night. She said, or during her park bench talk, she said, we've got to plan for climate and we've got to plan for equity with the same plan and at the same time, because there isn't resources for two plans and there isn't the time to do both. And so every project has to be both climate and equity, or equity and climate. They have to be interrelated. And yeah, I mean, every one of our projects now has resilience and equity at the core of, and at the same time, racial and socioeconomic justice. These are topics we're learning about, and it's an exciting time to be a planner because we're trying to undo the mistakes of the past when it comes to equity. But at the same time, it's a developing field for us. We're learning from people.
There's a question from Miranda on transfer of development rights. Do you have any experience with that? Use those in your plans like El Paso, other plans that are dealing with climate?
Yeah, I think every project has transfer of development rights as part of it. We used to transfer in order to preserve the environmental health of places. Now we're transferring in order to get people out of dangerous places. We know that TDR programs don't work more often than they do, unfortunately. There's a lot of great examples. The Pinelands in New York, the coastal protection in Cape Cod. There's a lot of examples where TDRs worked, but there's so many more examples where they didn't. But so you got to do TDRs yourself without actually using TDRs. And Pineland Prairie was that, right? Pineland Prairie, Newfield was moving people from one spot to another without ever using the acronym TDR, right?
Yeah, with Newfield, it was really taking a spot that was surrounded by development. It was farmland, and with that process, really putting a focus on densifying certain areas and where the best spot for the neighborhoods were, while at the same time keeping intact these large tracts of environmental area. You know, the whole property had a certain density that was permitted, but there were also a lot of wetlands. And so working on taking the rights from those areas in order to permanently preserve them and put them into the areas that were better suited to be developed. And then along with the process of getting that coded and the first layer of development rights with these densified areas, it then put those preserve plans into a trust in perpetuity so that someone can't come back later and decide that, oh, well, we really are going to develop these areas. They are now legally preserved in perpetuity. So there's that kind of thing where using the densification to preserve right where you are, not necessarily the larger citywide TDR programs.
And Pam talked about how Sandy Woods, TND in Tiverton, Rhode Island, is away from the coast. So in Rhode Island, everyone wants to live near the water, but it's getting more dangerous. And Newfield is a TND away from the coast of Florida. And it's a beautiful design and a great place to live, and people will move themselves without a TDR program making that happen.
I think those are both examples, you know, of setting up new places, but more densely than normally would be to allow more people into the area. Just more housing in smaller areas, but that people will choose.
Yeah.
It's a really good question from Jody. I'm going to just read it verbatim. Do you have any recommendations for gaining buy-in from municipal staff to step up and take a leading role as the coordinating body for a community-wide climate action plan when they are used to only addressing things that they have jurisdiction over through municipal operations? For instance, most community emissions emanate from residents and businesses, not the city operations directly.
Yeah, right. So number one, we see a lot of towns and cities developing CAPs, climate action plans, which is exciting, right? And the way they start is just like Jody's talking about. First, they start with the city itself. What's the city's, fleet, these vehicles? How can we turn them into electric? How can we put more electric charging stations? How can we put photovoltaics on top of our public buildings? That's where it starts. Getting the city itself to carbon zero. But then it can't stop. The problem with the climate adaptation plans is when they stop there, because just like Jody points out, the city itself is just a small actor, given all the people that live there. And so the newest climate action plans, the best ones that we're seeing, they start with the municipality, and then they apply those lessons citywide, townwide. And how do you get municipal planning staff to want to do that? There's a trend. It's happening. Our climate adaptation plans are going from very narrow focus to much larger. I think the climate adaptation plans in 20 years from now are going to be even regional. So we're watching these plans get more and more wider in scope and more important and more effective.
So maybe one final question, this has to do with something that I've been thinking about, and you addressed in your book and in your talk, and that had to do with trees. And they seem like a sort of a miracle drug for climate that can be employed on a local level, and they're they can be done. Ordinary people can make a difference with trees. You had a good quote about, plant a tree in your yard, plant a tree on the street. Forget the exact quote, but, basically, if they tell you you can't do that, you can ask forgiveness and ask them to change. change the law that says you're not allowed to plant it on the street if there is one. But tell me a little bit about trees. Why they're such an important tool for urban designers to address climate change, but yet it seems like Laredo, it's hard. It's sometimes getting harder and harder to plant these trees. Why is that happening? And what can we do about it?
Pam's the expert on Laredo. She should tell us about Laredo. But so trees are the one thing that both political parties can agree on, right? Everybody is for trees. And even across the world, you see North Korea planting millions of trees. They're committed to it. And Scotland, Africa, South America, all over. Just read about these massive tree campaigns that countries are involving themselves in, no matter what their politics, because everybody can agree that on trees. And the interesting thing that's happening is on the municipal level, on our local level, it's getting harder and harder to plant a tree. So the book talks about how just in our front yard, I applied for a tree permit. The city said, yes, we'll bring you trees. We'll bring you oak trees. We'll plant them for you. We waited 1.5 years and the trees never came. And so we went and we planted a small forest of street trees in the right of way, in the planting strip up and down our street. And that's illegal. So
But nobody said anything.
yeah, that's right. One night someone drove by and said to Pam, what are you doing planting this tree? Don't you know the roots are gonna break the sidewalk? But Pam fearlessly watered that tree that night anyway. What we're starting to do is we're putting into our codes that the property owner is allowed to plant a tree in the right of way. And if the city has any problem with it, they can themselves move that tree to the backyard. And Thomasville, Georgia is the first community that has this. It's basically a tactical urbanism, guerrilla tree planting intervention, which is in the code. It's allowed for. More municipalities have to adopt that. Otherwise, they end up in Laredo's position. You want to talk about Laredo?
Yeah, and it seems everyone in Laredo at the municipal levels, all municipal levels, were against trees for so many different reasons. First, there was the planning board didn't want trees. They wanted, or when they had trees, they needed enough room to grow. So they needed to be 4 feet from the street and they needed to be in the center of a planting area. So that means you need 8 feet. But if you already have an existing street, it's very rare that you have 8 feet between the street and the sidewalk or the street and the property. And so if you had less than 8 feet, you couldn't plant a tree. One of the reasons they wanted this, besides just giving it enough room to be watered, is the development community didn't want to add trees. And if they didn't make the street wide enough to have a 8-foot planting strip, then they didn't have to provide trees. And so then that could be a way to save costs on making affordable housing, only the cost didn't really get moved on to the cost of the house, it just added to their profit margin. But then we had the power company, and the power companies, you can't plant a tree near a power line. And the power companies want to be able to put their power lines, not just where they are, but wherever they may be needed in the future. And if there's a tree in the way, you can't have it. And you can't let those branches grow into the trees, because then they come down in storms and they have to be repaired. Water conservationists sometimes don't want trees because you have to water those trees, especially when they're first planted and they're establishing their roots. And if water is already a precious resource, why waste it on a tree? The fire marshal doesn't like big trees because then they can't get to the buildings from the road. And the tree warden didn't want trees because they had no money in their budgets in order to maintain them or to plant them. And so it's all these different areas it's coming from. Oh, and there was another one, they didn't want the trees because when you did water them, the water got on the street and that destroyed the street. Although coming from Florida, I don't really believe that one, because then your street must have also been subpar, because we get water all the time, so much less than they do in Laredo. And so there's all these attacks on trees for other reasons. And so it's trying to figure out how can you fix that and resolve that. You know, if there was a tree there before, a new tree will grow. It might not be the perfect specimen of a tree. It might live a few years less, but for the length that that tree is going to be there, it does have such great benefits, you know, providing oxygen, providing shade, providing a carbon sink, increasing property values, you know. And so it's just each one of these different reasons to be against something, you know, there are 10 million more reasons to be for it. And so it's just working on what is that one thing this person is caught up on, and how can we find a solution? Or, you know, if we can't put the tree on here, can we put it over there? And so just trying to figure out how do you get past all of these different objections.
And the book talks about that, and how to do that.
Well, Jason and Pam, we really appreciate this discussion. It's been great. Appreciate your expertise and all the people who have been participating in this and asking great questions. We're going to have clearly more on the park bench discussions on this issue and planning for climate change. So with that, I will bid everybody adieu and have a good rest of your week. And thanks once again.
I do, Rob. Thanks a lot.
Thanks,
Thanks for the
Rob.
opportunity.
Okay, bye.
Bye.